He was not born the king of men, but was a child of the common people, who made himself a great persuader, therefore a leader, by dint of firm resolve, patient effort, and dogged perseverance.
The man who wrote those words was a prominent newspaper man by the name of Horace Greeley, who during Lincoln's lifetime was often one of his severest critics. But even critics like Greeley recognized the source of Lincoln's power. Lincoln was a splendid communicator, a great persuader. He understood that the ability to communicate is essential to effective leadership. Lincoln mastered the fundamentals to such a degree that many scholars consider the best of his work, speeches such as the Second Inaugural Address and the Gettysburg Address, to be on a par with the finest pieces ever created in the English language. By following some simple, timeless principles of good communication, Lincoln achieved amazing results, advancing from the lowest ranks of American society to the executive mansion. If a backwoods boy on the frontier can pick up and master these principles, so can you. They can be relearned in any generation by those who seek to become successful, no matter where they came from or how far they want to go. To present these time-honored principles, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln.
I sometimes am asked how I managed to become president. It was certainly not my good looks. A woman came up to me once, she said, "Mr. Lincoln, you're the ugliest man I ever saw in my life." I said, "I can't help it." She said, "You could at least stay home." It was not due to my administrative ability. Prior to leaving Springfield, I'd never supervised anybody except a law clerk or two. My law firm was fairly successful, but more than once we had to admit to clients that we had misplaced important documents. I even kept a cardboard box labeled, "If you can't find it anywhere else, look into this." It was not my formal education. I never saw the inside of a high school, an academy, or a college. What formal education I did receive took place in little one-room schools on the frontier. Grand total of 1 year. But I was good at one thing. I learned to communicate with people. This is an invaluable skill. Through the years, I've noticed that people who learn how to communicate well are more likely to succeed than those who can't. Effective communication can improve your income, make sales, get you elected to office, win friends, and make the world a better place in which to live. I've been asked to briefly summarize what I know about the subject. In order to comply, I will rely on some of my speeches, plus letters, diaries, and newspapers of the time. Here are some underlying and timeless principles that I'd like to share with you. There are 10 of them. Principle number 1. If you want to communicate effectively, you must have something to say. I heard about a man who applied for a teaching job at a little one-room school back in Indiana. The committee asked him, "Do you believe the world's flat or round?" The man was desperate, so he said, "Doesn't matter to me. I'm prepared to teach it either way." Communication is sharing, but you cannot share what you do not have. There's no substitute for knowledge. No matter how skillful a speaker or writer you may be, if you're ignorant of something you could know, or if your knowledge is faulty, you will eventually be found out. I never learned to speak without embarrassment if I had nothing to say. There's a saying among lawyers that you should beware of an opponent who comes into court with only one book. What that means is the opponent has found one fact or one precedent so clear and so powerful that only one is needed. Often it takes no more than one sturdy piece of information to win your case, make your point, support your cause. If you want to communicate effectively, immerse yourself in a subject. I always loved to read. As a child, if I did not own a book, I'd try to borrow it. My father considered reading to be a form of laziness. He may have been partly right about that, because I did prefer reading to manual labor. He taught me to work, but he never taught me to love it. I was particularly fond of newspapers. One of the reasons I became postmaster at New Salem, Illinois, was so I could receive a newspaper free of charge. I also got a chance to read other people's papers before they came by to pick them up. When I became president, I had almost no knowledge of military science. Although I had been a captain briefly in the Black Hawk War, I had never seen combat. I never saw bloodshed, although I did engage in several ferocious battles with mosquitoes. To give you some idea of the depth of my knowledge, I was once drilling my little company, and we came up to a fence. I didn't have the slightest idea what command to give them to march around the fence. So I gave the command, "Company, halt." Then I told them, "We will assemble in a few minutes on the other side of the fence." Little did I know that one day I would preside over the costliest and the bloodiest war in human history up to that time. I gave myself night and day to the study of military affairs. I obtained numerous books from the Library of Congress. As the war progressed, I pored over reports and held long conferences with eminent generals and admirals until I learned how to ask good questions. To gain information, you may want to rely on other people to help you gather it. During the years that I practiced law, my law partner, Billy Herndon, often did the background research. Billy compiled a large notebook filled with information on briefs and authorities cited for the cases that we handled. It just makes good sense to team up with people who know what you don't know, or who can do what you can't do or don't want to do. Let others help you, but find your own voice. I received some excellent advice from William Seward for my first inaugural address. He suggested that I write, "Although passion has strained our bonds of affection too hardly, they must not, I'm sure they will not be broken." I chose to write instead, "Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." Often your research will turn up an idea that you can adapt to your own needs. When I resided in Springfield, I came upon a sermon written by Theodore Parker. In it, Parker spoke of direct government over all of the people, by all the people, for all the people. Sound familiar? It should. I underlined those words and years later used them to conclude my remarks at Gettysburg. That these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Principle 2. Learn to speak and write clearly. Among my earliest recollections, I can remember how, when a mere child, I used to get irritated when anybody talked to me in a way that I could not understand. I can remember going to my little bedroom after hearing the neighbors talk of an evening with my father, and spending no small part of the night trying to make out what was the exact meaning of some of their dark sayings. I could not sleep when I got on the hunt for such an idea until I'd caught it. And when I thought I'd got it, I was not satisfied until I'd repeated it over and over again, until I'd put it in language plain enough, as I thought, for any boy I knew to comprehend. This was a kind of passion with me, and it stayed with me. For I'm never easy now when I'm handling a thought. till I bounded it north and bounded it south, bounded it east and bounded it west. I also learned at an early age that if you want to be clear in your communications, you have to state your thoughts in a logical order. In my youth, I studied and learned the writings of Hugh Blair, who was an expert on rhetoric and composition. Here's what Blair taught. Embarrassed, obscure, and feeble sentences are generally, if not always, the result of embarrassed, obscure, and feeble thought. Thought and language act and react upon each other mutually. He that is learning to arrange his sentences with accuracy and order is learning at the same time to think with accuracy and order. I enjoyed analytical exercises. Most people think grammar to be pretty dull, useless, but I loved it. I was impressed by the logic of language. I looked for just the right word and tried to place it in the right order. Billy Herndon later described my general attitude, which I think fairly expresses my tendency. He said Lincoln was pitiless and persistent in the pursuit of truth. His thought processes were slow, but they were cold, clean, and exact. I found that I could communicate more clearly if I tried to compress as much information as I could into as few words as possible. Rarely is a long presentation as effective as a concise one. I happen to agree with Mark Twain. He said, "Not many sinners are converted after the first 20 minutes." That reminds me of a story about a long-winded politician. He went on and on. Finally, man got up and headed toward the door. And said, "Where are you going?" "Going home to shave." "Why didn't you shave before you came to the meeting?" "I did." I always look for the nib of the kernel of a story, the heart of an argument. Many of my instructions to military men went out over the telegraph wires. So I learned to use pithy, telegraphic comments. When Robert E. Lee's troops were retreating from Richmond, I wired General Grant. "General Sheridan says if the thing is pressed, I think Lee will surrender. Let the thing be pressed." Principle 3, be credible. You can fool all the people some of the time, and some of the people all the time. But you can't fool all the people all the time. Speaking of fooling people, there's one person you should never try to fool: yourself. I once wrote, "If at last when I come to lay down the reins of power, I've lost every other friend on earth, I shall at least have one friend left, and that friend shall be deep inside of me." I'm not bound to win, but I am bound to be true. I'm not bound to succeed, but I am bound to live up to the light that I have. If that internal friend is pleased with you, credibility will naturally follow. As Shakespeare put it, "This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day. Thou canst not then be false to any man." If you want to be credible, treat facts with respect. When I was a young man, I became a surveyor, spent a great deal of time studying mathematics in general, Euclid in particular. This taught me the need for accuracy and precision. Later, my study of law taught me how important it is to get things exactly right. If you didn't, you ran the risk that your opponent would seize on some inaccuracy and win the argument, even though you had the better case. I once defended a man by the name of William Duff Armstrong in a sensational murder case. I managed to save him from possible hanging with one important piece of information. A witness claimed to have seen my client murder a man by the light of a full moon. I produced an almanac that showed that the moon had not even risen at the time the murder occurred. If you want to be credible, don't be afraid to change your opinion if new facts present themselves. As my contemporary, Ralph Waldo Emerson, put it, do not be overly reverent about the actions of the past. Avoid any foolish consistency. Disenthrall yourself of your old biases and customary ways of looking at things. I told Congress, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. I did not have everything figured out when I became president. It's probably a good thing for the country that I did not. I responded to facts as I discovered them. If I made any assertion not warranted by facts, and it was pointed